Hello and welcome from Buenos Aires, Argentina to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where Nate has conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those that have some connection to Latin America. My name is Josefina Dominguez and I am an editor for LatinList, a proud sponsor of the Crossing Borders podcast. Sign up for our weekly updates on latinlist.com to get a summary of the week's biggest headlines in Latin American tech news. Nate's guest today is Maya Dadoo, CEO and founder of Worky, an HR tech platform from Mexico that is revolutionizing the way HR is managed in SMEs in Latin America. They talk about Maya's transition from consulting in the corporate world to going into tech and entrepreneurship, why HR is such a huge opportunity in Latin America where employee rotation rates are very high, and they also discuss how Worky has reacted to the shift caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Maya Dadoo.
Hey, Maya, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Of course. No, thank you. It's been a long time since we last spoke.
Yeah, it's going to be good to catch up here.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you in the world today?
So I am based out of my Mexico City apartment, which is quite nice. It's green, it's spacious, and I live close to a park, so I can't complain.
It's a good place to be.
Not quite Wisconsin, but very nice.
I think I'd switch back. I'm going to switch back eventually.
Great.
To Wisconsin for now, but I'll be back in Mexico.
Amazing.
So tell me a little bit about Worky. What are you up to?
So Worky, I don't know, I mean, you know about this, but Worky is an all-in-one HR software built for the Mexican SME. So we launched our product back in 2018. It's been 2 years since product launch, and we have north of 170 companies using us to date. So it's been quite an exciting journey, a journey where we've learned a lot about product, ramping up sales teams and having that feedback loop constantly directed from sales to product to build the best-in-class software that the Mexican market can have.
And tell me a little bit about why that's a problem in the Mexico market. What's the underlying reality of SMEs in the region?
What is interesting is that when you look at a traditional SME, you have quite a couple of problems. So one of them is that a traditional SME doesn't hire an HR manager until they reach the 30 employee watermark. Right? And at this point in time, it's usually the CEO or someone within the C-suite that is doing most of the HR work. So hiring, firing, employee evaluations, recruiting, etc. It tends to be quite tedious. And then the second component of it is that when you hire an HR manager, these HR managers are working with 12 Excel sheets on average. So it tends to be heavily operated where information isn't necessarily flowing within the organization as it should. So the information sits with the HR manager, but the employee isn't having the transparency that he or she should have, as well as the CEO doesn't have enough information to be able to operate the company more strategically. So that's what we're solving on a first case. And the second case, or the flip side of the coin, which tends to be the most interesting to me, is that we started to realize that in Mexico, it's a horrible statistic, but SME employees rotate at 60% rates a year, which is ridiculous if you come to think of it, because there are 20 million Mexicans working in SMEs. And if 12 million of them are rotating every single year from their job, on the first hand, economy is stagnant, right? There's no growth because you're not able to retain the talent. But then the second is that talent isn't actually being developed in Mexico. So productivity as a nation isn't really increasing. And when me and my co-founder Carlos started to dig into the data, we found that the employee rotation was caused very specifically because of the lack of benefits that SMEs give their employees. And when you look and think of, for example, the US market, it's very different, whereby the benefit that employees seek the most is insurance, and that's how Zenefits started. But in Mexico, the benefit that employees want the most are payroll loans and personal loans. And talking to financial institutions, we realized that, for example, Bancomer, Scotiabank, and Santander, they won't loan to an employee if he or she has been working in this SME for less than, and given nationwide rotations, this is a market of zero. So we understood the potential of being able to provide loans to these employees and underwriting them through data.
It's really amazing that SMEs can actually get anything done in Mexico if 60% of their workforce is leaving every year. I can't imagine in like our business if we lost 60% of our team every year. It's really incredible.
It is quite shocking. And if you come to think of it, there are industries where it's even higher. So when you look at restaurants, construction workers, and heavily operational industries, this rotation is north of 100% a year. Call centers, 100% of the employees switch every 6 months. So wow. This is incredibly tedious. So I think there's a massive opportunity in the market.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We're going to put a cork in that part for a bit here and go back into your backstory, and then we'll talk more about Worky in a bit. But did you always know that you wanted to be in tech, or is that something that came up in your business career?
So I am from Mexico City originally. I'm a chemical engineer from undergrad. And I would say that I really like problem solving. I like efficiency. I like ops. It's why I chose my undergrad. And so my transition after I graduated from Penn was to work in consulting. So I was at BCG for 2 years. I was in Banamex also for a little bit under 2 years. And after that, I went to business school. Something that I did realize at business school was that, and if you come to think of it, I entered Stanford in 2012. And of the close to 20 Latin Americans that were in my class, about 2 or 3 of them had worked in technology before, which is crazy when you think about how the world works today. All of us had trainings in consulting or in banking, but really technology hadn't hit the ground as aggressively as it has today. So at Stanford and over my internships, I realized that I needed to be in tech if I wanted to feel empowered and wanted to feel relevant in my profession over the next couple of years. So after Stanford, I worked at eBay. And at eBay, which was really interesting, is that they had Craigslist replicas around the world. And they had just acquired a Mexican company called Viva Anuncios. So I took the role of finance and analytics for the region, which was really interesting because I hadn't been exposed to technology or product tech necessarily before, but I had to hit the ground running. And something that I really enjoyed about technology that I didn't actually get to experience a lot in Banamex was how quickly decisions can be made and how quickly operational improvements can be executed. So I fell in love with that aspect of eBay. And most importantly, I think all the data that you have at hand. How do you actually parse the data and make the relevant decisions in the minute? So really enjoyed that. And my transition from then I was transferred to Mexico City to start building up the team together with a GM. And at that point, something interesting happened, which was that I felt far away from where the decisions were being taken. So I was no longer in SF with the management team or the leadership team. I was in Mexico City, which was interesting because I got to operate with a lot of independence, but at the same time, the decisions were being made in SF. And so at that point in time, I started realizing that I did want to become an entrepreneur. And I think I always thought about that. And reading back through my Stanford essays just last week, I realized that I think I did have that inquisitiveness of becoming an entrepreneur. I just didn't know what sector, what industry to work in.
So let's talk about that journey from corporate to CEO. How did you decide it was time to go start your own thing rather than continuing to work in another corporate situation?
Well, I think I hit a point in my life where I was very comfortable. I was corporate employee. I had an excellent paycheck, but I also had certain flexibility and independence that I could take a new risk at this point in time. So I could dedicate a lot more time to work. I didn't have a partner at the time. I don't have kids. And so, I had a cushy salary and I had a lot in savings, so I couldn't necessarily take the dive into entrepreneurship. But I think the most important factor came in when I met my co-founder, Carlos, and we had a period of close to 2 months or 3 months of chats and interviews and getting to know whether we could work together to create something wonderful. And when I realized that he was actually also very interested in the HR tech space, but he had a different perspective, and that our skill set complemented each other quite well, that's when we sought to look for financing. And I think the financing aspect I won't diminish, which was that we were able to raise capital when we still had jobs. So the switch over to entrepreneurship was a lot more cushy than it could have been had I just quit eBay and worked in a project for 6 months and then, raised capital for Worky.
You mentioned you were interested in HR tech.
Mm-hmm.
How did you decide to do Worky and this solution rather than any other business you could have started?
It was really interesting. So when I came over with eBay to Mexico, I worked a lot with the finance team, and we were expanding the team. And something that I became very aware was that as we were scaling the team, and I don't know if a lot of your listeners know, but there's a tendency in Mexico whereby most companies outsource their employees. And this was the case in eBay. We worked with an awesome outsourcing firm, but it means that you don't actually control the whole process, right? Of hiring, firing, employee reimbursements, and any factor that does actually hit payroll. So every 15 days, as we hired, fired, we had a massive sales team that was constantly traveling, had reimbursements and sales commissions. The information wasn't flowing neatly from us to our outsourcing firm and back to the employee. So every 15 days, we had gotten a commission wrong, or every 15 days, we failed to indicate that Nathan was now part of the eBay team, or that we had let go of Maya. And this information was just becoming a massive time issue for me and for our finance manager. And so I looked over to see what other firms were using in Mexico, if there was a software that they were using, or how were they working around this information triangle with the outsourcing firms. And then this is when I realized there's actually nothing in the Mexican market. And when you look over at the Mexican space, you'll find incumbents, so you'll find old payroll calculators. But these payroll calculators sit with the accountant. They're not actually user-friendly for the employee or for the HR manager, for the finance manager, or for the outsourcing firm. So this is when I realized I could actually start building something really interesting that laser focused on the pre-payroll and payroll component. And as I met Carlos, his opinion, he worked in VC, he realized that a VC's, as a VC analyst, the time, or kind of like the return that he could give his portfolio companies was more focused on helping them retain their employees and helping them recruit. So he'd realized the other focus of it, which was that there was a massive employee rotation within even well-funded startups in Mexico City.
So we talked a little bit before about some of the problems in the industry that maybe people from outside of Mexico wouldn't understand. What other surprising things about the market and about the industry would somebody, maybe an investor who lives in the US, would find really interesting about this market, or wouldn't understand about the local culture for this type of a product or solution?
It's a good question. Historically, there hasn't been anything like us in the Mexican market. So while the US, you have Zenefits, Gusto, Jazz HR, and Namely, and a ton of HR-focused softwares. The HR software in the US, it's even further advanced, where you have, for example, very integral and well-executed recruiting softwares or evaluation softwares. So the industry there is developed, but it's also pulverized. Whereas what we see in Mexico is that there hasn't been any HR innovation for either large companies or smaller firms. And so this is an incredible white space that we needed to build. And it's been one of the interesting things about launching Worky is that essentially we're sitting in 2020 and I'm replacing Excel. This is not normal. It wouldn't be normal for a developed market, but it is the reality here in Mexico, and it's probably the reality as we sit across Latin America. And the natural assumption would be, okay, well, Maya, you're working with SMEs. But even as you talk to public companies that have 3,000 employees, you'll see the case that they're still working with Excel. So that's one reality. And the other reality that I kind of hate that I'm building a product for this, Nathan, but it is the Mexican reality, is that timesheets are still very important here in Mexico. No, and you'll see that companies do check what time the employee is arriving at work and what time the employee is leaving at. And so creating a product that's able to give management this transparency, even as we sit in 2020, even as we sit in coronavirus times where people are working from home, people still want to know whether an employee is working from 9 to 5 or 9 to 8, which is the case in Mexico. So this is actually quite counterintuitive.
Another part that you mentioned earlier is that some of the bigger companies that you work with are interested in payroll loans.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that part of the market and what your service is replacing if someone didn't have you.
So I talked about how the larger banks won't loan to SME employees. And Carlos and I went over and chatted to SOFOMs, which is formal yet formal and regulated loaning entities, just not banks. And when we were asking them about the opportunity in payroll loans, they gave a funny reply, which was I actually wasn't happy about, but it gave me the opportunity to build Worky, which was that, no, Maya, we actually do loan, and we have 90% of our loan wallet is payroll loans. But you know what? It's just focused towards public sector employees or government employees. Because once you enter government, you'll always have a job, which is the reality here in Mexico City. You'll change governments, but you're still working within public sector, which means that if Maya is asking for a payroll loan and she works in the Secretary of Economy or in Pemex, I can actually integrate from payroll and I can deduce the amount from payroll. But with SMEs, there's a fear, and there's a fear because of this initial factor that's the most determinant one, which is rotation. If Maya leaves working for X SME and she asks for a payroll loan, I won't actually be able to find her, but I actually can predict a couple of things. How employable is Maya? How long will she stay within the company, and what's the company rotation? And that gave me a really valuable insight to what we needed to build in Worky and how we could exploit the use of data. So within Worky, which is an all-in-one HR software, we do have actually a lot of data points that start to become relevant to enable us to position these loans, which is we know whether companies are growing or downsizing, economy-wide, but also industry-wide or geographically focused. We also know how well Maya is evaluated. What's her peer review? Or if Maya sits in sales, is she winning commissions or not? And so all these different data points allow us to say, you know what? Maya is a risky employee. She should have a loan with, a 4% monthly interest rate. Whereas Nathan is an incredible performer at Magma. He should have a loan at a 2% interest rate. And so when you look over to the alternative that these employees have, they don't actually have any alternative, because the regulated but informal lenders aren't covering SME space. The banks aren't covering SME space. And so the loans that they're able to obtain are mostly through loan sharks with interest rates as high as 8% per month. And so I think that the impact of Worky is actually very positive, that we not only solve, the HR function holistically within the organization, but we also have a very strong bond with employees in providing them financial alternatives.
And also I would think that the employees would end up, even though it's no fault of their employer, they're going to end up mad at their employer if they end up getting a bigger and bigger chunk of money taken out of their payroll, if they're at the loan shark paying the 8% or even 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8% that they would be using from a traditional lender instead of going with you.
Exactly. So this is I love this point, because when your users love you, and I think generally when you're building a software, you have to get your users to adore you. And one of the things that I feel very proud of is that the HR admins that use us love us. And I'll talk more about how COVID, or we've strengthened that bond over with COVID. But also we realize that employees really, really like us. And we have an incredible engagement from our users on a weekly basis. And we started to notice that when you come to think of the leads that we receive, from selling Worky, a really important percent of these leads are coming direct or organic. And when we try to dig in a little bit more, is that the HR admins are referring us to their peers, but also the employees. As they rotate firms, we realize that they go up to the HR manager and say, you know what? In my previous company, they were using Worky, through which my onboarding to the company was done better, but also we had a lot of benefits that Worky provided that you're not necessarily providing. So you should look up into this. So that's a part of that I love.
That's cool. Yeah, let's talk about COVID and how Worky has reacted to it and some of the problems that maybe you're solving now. How has it affected you, and what are some of the things you're doing?
We have to keep growing, and we have to keep growing because now more than ever, our software is relevant. You need to manage your employees better. You have to migrate how you work with your employees to have real-time data and data that sits in the cloud. And so we worked on a lot of different outbound strategies and outbound projects together with my sales and marketing team and biz dev. And what that's proven to be is that we now know how to approach outbound sales at a much more interesting way that we were doing before. So this has been a very positive change for us. And in terms of a product perspective, it has allowed us to sit and reflect of the product that we're building and how we have to build for the new future of work, right? And a lot more companies are being flexible with home offices. So how does that affect, or how does that feedback loop come back to our product and design team? So I'm happy to say that when we compare, for example, April was a big hit for us where we saw the immediate effect that the economy had with our clients. And so close to 10% of our clients asked for financing alternatives. And we're very happy to give that to our clients. And one of the ethos that we have with Worky, and Oscar, our CTO, Carlos, our COO, and I have, is that we're in this for the long run, and we're in this for the long run with our clients as well. And so if you have trouble paying today, it's no problem. We want you to use us for the next 4 years. So we've been able to give financing alternatives or 2 months free to our clients. And I'm happy to say that a lot of our clients are doing much better this month, and they're back into their paying plan. So I think that it's given us a way to reflect on what we provide our users, our HR managers, or our HR manager clients are very busy today. And they're busy because they've needed to shrink teams, and they're needed to understand how to motivate the staff that's working remotely. And so we provide webinars, we provide meditation sessions, stretching sessions, and different workshops for them. So it's giving us a time of how do we approach this problem holistically, both internally and user facing.
One of the things you just mentioned again is the access to capital, thinking about making sure that you had enough money in the bank. And at the very beginning of the business, you said that you're fortunate to be able to raise money while you were still working and have an easier transition into the business. Talk a little bit about your fundraising journey, how you've thought about it, and where you are today.
Yeah, so we've raised 2 rounds in the past. And I think the initial round that we raised it allowed us to get our product to market, right? So we raised very little capital, but enough capital to pay a minimal wage, but a decent wage to ourselves, and hire the technology team. And so that got us to product launch over in 2018. And then we really had to think about how to spend and what key hires we had to make. So initially, Carlos and I, mainly Carlos was the sales member. I was more of a product manager, and then there was no expense spared for technology. And once we felt comfortable that we got to an initial product market fit, then we raised a subsequent round. And what was interesting in this transition is that over in 2018, our product was free, right? And it was free for most of our users because we wanted to validate that we were building a product that even if it was free, users were using. So even in 2018, no cash was coming into the bank, but it was mostly paying expenses. And when you're building a SaaS, most of the expenses are within the tech team, and it's mostly payroll. So when we had this product market fit, we realized we needed to raise a new round in order to be able to hire a sales team and start injecting a little bit more into marketing. So that got us to date. And we are announcing a big round that we closed with QED. And we've just raised capital with them for our seed, which we're really happy and excited about. They're incredible partners.
For those that want to learn more about QED, we have an episode with Mike Packer that I'll put in the show notes. You can hear about their investment in all of the top fintechs across the region. They're one of the top US funds investing in the region. So it's really good. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, we're very, very excited.
Do you have any books, blogs, podcasts, or documentaries you'd like to recommend to people, whether about business or just life in general?
Yes. So one that's been incredibly helpful was Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. And where you realize that growing a company has a series of pits and falls, and that you just have to be constantly resilient and looking for ways in which you have to problem solve and keep growing.
What's next for Worky over the next year or two?
Over the next year, well, as we've closed this round, is generally scaling. And I think when you look at the next stage that we want to keep focusing on the software. So we want to keep focusing on the intuitiveness, the breadth of the product, and the flexibility that we have with our customers. So you can expect for us to have a mobile app, and you can expect us to be working with a lot more clients that aren't necessarily in the professional services space as they are today, but how do we gravitate towards more of an operational industry whereby employees don't necessarily have access to email, but they need to have the transparency with which the organization is run. So this is a massive kind of like product focus that we have over the course of this next year. And subsequent to that is growing our sales organization. And once we know that we are ready to inject more capital and hire our sales team, and how that converts into actual revenue.
I'm excited to see how you use your new round of funding to grow across the region. Thanks for taking the time to share your story, and I hope we can do a round 2 sometime in the future here and check back in and see how you're doing.
Yes, I'd love that. Thank you so much for your time, Nate. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with our guest, Maya Dadoo. And thank you to Angel Andraca for producing this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend and give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the best way to share what's going on in Latin America's ecosystem.